It's fantastic to see a turnout like this in person, and we have another, how many online? 130 online, so probably 250 people here for what I think is a really important discussion. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land that Weehai uses in Parkville, in Kew, in Bundoora and down on Elizabeth Street. And I know I speak on behalf of everybody here to say that we pay our respects to their elders past and present and embrace their continued connection to the places where we work. I think we also have come to recognise that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are the first scientists on this continent, and they ask questions and especially look to the land, the sky, the animals and plants for answers. We acknowledge their ingenuity, resilience, design capability and collaborative and creative thinking that enabled them and enables them today to survive and thrive in what are some of the harshest lands on Earth. And we also celebrate the fact that they've ensured that their voices and their designs and their discoveries have been passed on from generation to generation. So welcome everybody. Today, as I said, we're focusing on what I think is arguably the most significant issue for medical research and its future, and that is the integrity of our science and our response to misconduct. And I want to spend a few minutes reflecting on why this is so important. I firmly believe that science remains humanity's best tool to understand the universe, to survive and to flourish. And extending that a little bit to our domain, I think it's our best tool to defeat the diseases that we, our friends and families all dread. Incurable cancers, untreatable dementias, devastating childhood diseases, pandemic infection. And to be effective, science must be accepted and translated into policy or new treatments that are embraced by the community. And for this to happen, the community must retain its faith in science. In thinking about that, what are the values of science and the qualities of research that we do cherish and that lead to this privileged position of being one of humanity's best tools to tackle difficult and uncertain future? And I think there are 4 ingredients. The first is that the data that forms the basis of our publications is robust and presented honestly, and that conflicting data shouldn't be withheld because it doesn't fit with an expedient narrative. I think the second quality is that if data is found to have issues, that the scientific record's corrected immediately. A third value that I think is important are that the methods that we use to generate data are described accurately and in enough detail to enable others to reproduce the data, and that reagents are shared openly for the same reasons. These first 3 values are critical if we're to provide a solid foundation on which others can build, and this is one of the most important hallmarks of research quality. The 4th value is that scientists are open to the possibility that the conclusions they draw from the data may not be correct in all their details. And there's no shame in this. And I think over time it might be argued that this is more or less the fate of most papers. Being open-minded and full of doubts and self-doubt, to me, is the antithesis of how most of society engages in most conversations most of the time. So think about discussions on social media. That we hold steadfastly to these values is not just a matter of retaining our social licence to operate so that we receive public and philanthropic funding and hold onto our jobs. It's much deeper than that. It's about the community retaining confidence that science is indeed the way to tackle and solve the big problems. It's about the community insisting their elected representatives follow the science when tackling big challenges. In Australia, the US and elsewhere, when considering big problems like climate change and COVID, we've seen the problems that can arise when parts of the community turn their back on science. One of the risks to public confidence in science are scientists that don't uphold the 4 values. that I outlined earlier, and scientific community does not hold them to account. Every profession should have a mechanism to deal with serious wrongdoing that's independent, fair and transparent. And I want to do a straw poll. Who in the room would trust political parties to properly hold members suspected of corruption to account? Who would have more faith in an independent commission against corruption? It's really interesting. I think I've never seen an academic rail against the idea of an ICAC, but I have sure seen academics rail against the idea of an independent office for research integrity. WEHI has long argued for an independent body to consider issues of scientific misconduct, and it's been an imperative for me in my time as director, and it's been championed by our leadership team and particularly our former Deputy Director, Dave Vogt. But over the last 10 years, it's not been universally embraced, and we still don't have this body. The fact that so many people have joined here in person and online from MRIs, from hospitals and universities says to me that the time has come to make this a reality. And I'm delighted that Professor Ian Chubb has accepted our invitation to speak on this important topic today. Over a long career, Professor Chubb has been seen the sector from many different angles and faced many challenges. He's consulted widely and worked to make sure that we're proposing the right sort of independent research integrity body with the right powers and the right mandate to address misconduct. He's been a strong and effective advocate for government and industry support of innovation and research in science in an amazing array of roles, including over several decades, including being Chief Scientist, Vice-Chancellor of Australian National University and Flinders University, Deputy Vice-Chancellors at Monash, Deputy Vice-Chancellor at Wollongong and Chair of the Commonwealth Higher Education Council. He was ACT Australian of the Year, holds many honorary doctorates and was awarded the Australian Academy of Science Medal and elected a Fellow of the Academy in 2017. In his retirement, and this does fill me with dread as somebody who has announced that they may not be seeking a new term as director, in his retirement, he's Policy Secretary for the Academy of Science, chairs an independent expert panel advising Queensland and Australian governments on the Great Barrier Reef, and he's part of a committee advising on the development of a single national policy for clinical trials. Retirement doesn't sound that much fun. Ian, we're delighted that you've given us time for this inaugural Ethics Week in Parkville, Ethics Celebration in Parkville, and we're looking forward very much to your comments on this crucial issue. Ian.
Thanks, Doug, and thank you all. It is good to be here because this is something that we've taken up as an Academy of Science, and I'll talk about that in a few moments. But it's also important to do it here because of the work that's been done by people in this institution and indeed in this area on this important topic. And I'll make some comments that might indicate why. I should say that I'm not used to seeing myself in such large relief, and I don't know. I know a lot of people who would find that not particularly pleasant to see me in that, but I should say that that photograph was taken to fit a story that was headlined, "Is Ian Cured?" And the reason is that I'd just come out of a clinical trial. I had metastatic renal cell carcinoma, and through a series of steps that, when I look back on it, I realise how lucky I was, but I got into a stage 3 clinical trial and 2 antibodies, 2 years, lost taste, couldn't even taste beer, couldn't taste wine, couldn't taste food. So I lost a lot of weight. Not that that photograph shows I was beginning to recover normal self. But within about, I guess it was infusions over 2 years and every 3 weeks. And I did an X-ray because I was getting pleural effusion towards the end of just before the trial started. And they did an X-ray after about, I think it was 3 infusions, couldn't see any any lesions in the lungs. And the oncologist said to me, it's too early and, it's not very sensitive, but we'll see what the next CT does. So the next CT did show smaller lesions. I had 4 in the lungs. And but after about 3 more infusions, there were no signs of lesions. The lymph took a long time to go down. But I was getting one of my infusions one day and the journalist rang up and he said, have you got time to talk? I said, well, yeah, as a matter of fact, I do. I'm sitting in a Jason recliner with a plastic tube up my vein. And so he talked about why, and he said, oh, I'll write a story about it. So the headline was, is Ian cured? And that was the photograph that went with a related story. It's one of the reasons why I do the work that Doug just mentioned about a national policy for clinical trials in Australia. It was orchestrated by the Department of Health, Commonwealth Department of Health. All the jurisdictions are on board. We got a position out of it all. It took a while because all the jurisdictions are at different levels of engagement and different levels of commitment already, and indeed investment. And as far as I know, that's with government at the moment to try to then establish the group and fund a bespoke platform that will satisfy all the needs of all the jurisdictions and all the different sorts of clinical trials that are now available. And I reckon it'd be a good thing. So I did it because I've got skin in the game. This was 6 years ago, and 6 years ago, I think. And so if you want to put something back, I thought it would be worthwhile to put that back. And arm wrestling jurisdictions is always an interesting thing to do, and gives you a certain level of fitness. So let me get to the story today. The story today is in basically 2 parts. I'm going to touch lightly on research integrity in the first bit and just raise a few issues, essentially to hopefully catalyse some discussion about some of the issues that arise. It's very selective, of course, and it's not at all comprehensive, so we might be able to get into some more depth as we go through. And the second bit will be about what the Academy of Science has been doing about trying to get a federal government interest in setting up a Research Integrity Australia to handle the way we do really essentially serious misconduct in a way that is satisfies people who have an instinct to be cynical and criticise what happens if you leave it to us to do it to ourselves. And I don't believe that there's a particularly strong case for us to argue that anymore for the reasons that Doug mentioned, indeed. So let me start then with something I expect we can agree on, and that is that maintaining public confidence and trust in our research is essential. And the reason for that is pretty straightforward, really, that most of the funding that comes to us for research comes from the public, directly and indirectly, either through grants from governments, for example, or donations, philanthropy. But somebody gives us the money. We don't, it doesn't just grow off the wee-high money tree that I saw in the foyer as I arrived this morning. But we can't expect, I think, the support that we need to do the research that we're capable of doing. And I think that's an important qualifier, that it's the research that we're capable of doing. And we can't expect support to be looked at favourably if there's limited confidence in our research and its integrity. So it's a hard ask to simply say, do things better and do things differently. And by the way, we all know that every time somebody does something that somebody doesn't like, it's criticised or whatever in the press. So how do we do it? Well, I don't think we do it without offering something in exchange. And I don't think that we offer nothing in the righteous hope that nothing offered by us will mean that nothing is done to us. The alternative is to get ahead of the game and lead change so that we can help design one that in which we are mostly comfortable, or most of us are comfortable most of the time. So we know that we live in a time of rapid and accelerating change and crisis. The broader technological developments that are disrupting society impact on us, impact on you, scientists and your work, as much as they do anyone else. Some things continue, of course, and we know, and you know, that research is most often published after peer review. And peer review is an important issue for us, whereby manuscript is sent to peers who review the results, the data, the interpretations and conclusions that are drawn by the authors, and they approve it for publication or they don't, or they recommend that it be amended before it is. But in my view, one of the important, probably the most important part of peer review is the next bit, when published work is open to the scrutiny of anybody who wants to read it, particularly experts. And when research withstands the scrutiny of multiple peers, the public can have confidence that research is competently conducted and that the conclusions are reasonable. And if, as Doug said, we change them because we learn more as we go along and so on, of course, that's the very nature of the beast that we deal with, the scientific method indeed. But at that time, those conclusions are reasonable, and I remind people that when I finished my DPhil, I knew more about 2 amino acids in the active centre of one enzyme than anybody else in the world for a week. And then we got on with it. But we also know that the nature of scholarly publishing and the dissemination of results of research is changing, and we have to deal with that. It isn't what it used to be, certainly isn't quite what it used to be, but that's a different story, and I'm not going to go into that in detail today. But before the pandemic, and still now, there have been challenges to the integrity of science and the centrality of science to policy debate. An Australian instance close to me, given one of my jobs that Doug mentioned earlier, has been that of marine science. The health of Australian reef systems, particularly the Great Barrier Reef, has become emblematic of political debates around climate change and about research and its value and its substance and its integrity. One of the greatest threats to the health of the reef is, this is the Great Barrier Reef, is rising sea temperatures and marine heat waves caused by global warming. Other compounding issues, including water quality concerns due to land-based runoff, have added to the reef's vulnerability. In 2018, in response to coral bleaching and the prospect of an endangered listing by the World Heritage Committee, the Australian and Queensland governments made commitments around fiscal and regulatory changes to help reduce the stressors impacting the GBR. Now, it's long been accepted that improving the quality of water runoff into the reef lagoon would reduce one of those compounding stresses. Changes were made to the regulations of water quality, but despite best efforts and attempts, water quality targets were not being met. So the Queensland Government decided to introduce new regulations that it hoped would accelerate industry efforts to change practices and lead to improvements. As expected, these were vociferously resisted. Some people were encouraged to seize on arguments that scientific evidence underpinning the regulations was unreliable. Proponents of this view argued that scientific evidence informing policy making was weak, in part because of the so-called replication crisis that had not been dealt with by the scientific community. A few years ago, one of the proponents, one with a PhD, said to a conference in the Netherlands, which I presume he didn't think would get back to Australia, and I quote, "We're using the replication crisis to convince the politicians that, you know, if you've got a problem in medical science, why haven't you got a problem with the Great Barrier Reef science?" The replication crisis, he said, is a dagger at the heart of the climate alarmists and the Great Barrier Reef alarmists. He went on, and I quote again, "I think it's a lot easier to show the reef is not in trouble than to demonstrate unequivocally that the climate change thing is a total myth. If we can suddenly change everybody's mind that actually the reef is fine, it will get them thinking, when they've been telling us the reef is dying for so many years, then what about all these other things that we've been told about? In other words, use the reef, the GBR, as a Trojan horse if you can, while you can, and do and say whatever you think that it takes." I got into a bit of trouble by advising ministers that this is similar to the strategy of the tobacco lobby and indeed the lead in petrol lobby, which incidentally successfully got the onus of proof reversed. Because of the economic value of the anti-knock additive to petrol in the 1920s, scientists were asked to show that tetraethyl lead in petrol was dangerous before it should be removed, not asked to show that it was safe to use. we've got to be careful of these issues. Anyway, the rancour got to such a level that in 2019-20 a Senate inquiry was called, not into the merits of the water regulations of the Queensland Government, but the science. As I recall, the inquiry headed off a petition to the Parliament from members of the government at the time, arguing that research that influenced policies to do with the GBR should first go to the Australian National Audit Office for review before they would be used. The Australian National Audit Office for review before they could be used. The Senate inquiry was a hostile place, and several very fine scientists, many of whom I know, were treated disgracefully by senators, outrageously. Nevertheless, the report dismissed the claims about scientific integrity, but the very existence of this inquiry demonstrated the risks to the science and research system when politics takes over, and when our standard response is too much like, give us the money and go away. It is about taking control. It is about trying to plan a future that you can control, but legitimately so, openly so, transparently so, and constructively so. If we agree that issues around replication, reproducibility and integrity of science are real in some fields, does that mean that much of the work is dodgy? Clearly there are some who simply and willfully extrapolate issues from one field to any field if they don't like the evidence it's providing, and get a win because it suits some political purpose or other at that particular time. But does it really reveal something else to us, something important about how we go about the analysis and interpretation of science and data? But it's not wrong, it's not dodgy, it's just different. In one experiment published in 2021, roughly 3 million data sets were provided to multiple analysts in several different culturally diverse countries. I think it was 48 or something. Not 48 countries, 48 analysts. They were asked to test two hypotheses regarding the effects of scientists' gender and professional status on verbosity during group meetings, using the methods of their choice. Now, that's something that all of us think about from time to time. I can certainly remember how could we shut up the head of department when I was a young academic. I never told him though, just in case. But they were the hypotheses that were tested. And the researchers reported after the event, the analysts could make some definitions, but they all used the same data. The researchers reported radically different and dispersed empirical outcomes, in a number of cases obtaining significant effects in opposite directions for the same research question. So it depended on the conclusions from the study suggest that subjective researcher decisions play a critical role in driving the reported empirical results, underscoring the need for open data, systematic robustness checks, transparency regarding both analytical paths taken and not taken. So then you have a different discussion. You don't assume that somebody's using dodgy, confected, manufactured data. You think about how they went about analysing the data, and these show that you can get quite different results, 180-degree different results, just depending on what you bring to the table. So the notion of replication is complicated, but it can be misused, and it has been misused. It's not always about something being dodgy, it's about what skills, inclinations and experiences the analysts bring to the task, and emphasises the need to open data to scrutiny, and it also opens the obvious need for those who generate the data to be open to critique, to criticism, and to re-evaluation of what conclusions they draw from the data, depending on what other people bring to the table. Now, this is where the Academy of Science became involved. There are times when serious misconduct is exposed after publication, usually, of course, by the peer community. The traditional response is to leave it to the researchers' organisations to investigate any complaint and to take responsibility for resolving the issue. This self-regulation does not always inspire confidence. Whether that's fair or unfair, it's a fact that it doesn't always inspire confidence. Over a number of years, Academy Fellows have been exposed to the failings of the current system. All too often, we collectively reveal that we lack the transparency and that we lack the will sometimes to effectively satisfy policymakers and the public that we are maintaining the integrity of our system. The current structure, architecture features an Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research, which was revised most recently in 2018, which covers all organisations receiving ARC and HMRC funding, Australian Government research block grants and medical research institutes. Complaints and investigations of matters breaches of the code are handled by the individual institutions, and there's an Australian Research Integrity Committee which can hear appeals from individuals on the basis of process only. In theory, this constitutes a focused national system, but the roughly $4 billion allocated to industry as part of the tax incentive scheme for industry, plus all the rest that goes to industry, is not included, and nor are the research agencies. So in practice, it's not a national focused system. In 2018 and 2020, the Crime and Corruption Commission in Queensland conducted an audit of the implementation of the code by the universities in that state. In 2018, they found the implementation of the code to be variable, which is probably a euphemism. In 2020, the good news is that they found increasing compliance and improved processes. But nevertheless, the heart of the system remains self-regulation. Now, that may have been okay once, but it's a fair question to ask whether it's still acceptable practice for a much bigger system in which the number of people involved in the system and the rewards at the individual and institutional level have increased, in some cases exponentially. And so has the commitment of public funds, even if they are less than we think they should be. So maybe it would be okay if community mores had not changed, but they have. So there's been a marked shift in attitudes to self-regulation. It's increasingly common for there to be independent oversight and scrutiny of actions and outcomes of many agencies and organisations and professions. There are industry ombudsmen, there are inspectors general, there are inspectors general of the intelligence agencies, the AFP and so on, and the list gets longer all the time. So why are we different from that? Doug asked the question earlier, why are we different from that? So we focused on research misconduct because the whole issue of research integrity that I touched on very lightly is a big and important issue and something that we should take up as well. But when we think about what research misconduct, one of the difficulties is that the definition and meaning of the term change depending on whom you speak to. When dealing with policymakers and politicians, it gets more complicated again. While we understand that there are different gradations to the serious notions of bad science, unethical conduct, deliberate fraud, versus a dispute over authorship, careless supervision, and so on. In the political system, they're all treated as much the same level of conduct or misconduct. So over time, the policy environment on safeguarding research and public trust in science shifts. Scepticism becomes more common, even suspicion. And the ones who are elected by this public, they read the tea leaves and they want to keep their jobs. And they get elected every 2.7 years, federally anyway, in this country on average at the moment. So if that's the issue and the community system has shifted and we as a former Vice-Chancellor or the present Vice-Chancellors do what I used to do, say to ministers, give me the money and nick off, I don't think that the climate, the context within which you have that discussion is as it was when I used to do it anything up to a long time ago, 25 years ago indeed. So what to do about it? Before I get to that, a few words on what not to do. There is a substantial risk, I think, to laissez-faire. The she'll be right approach we enjoy in this country, the fact that we will argue that we're different from everybody else after all, that no worries, we'll handle it, we'll handle any problems when they arise in any way we feel appropriate at the time. I don't think that's going to get us very far. And in that context, if we get a major research misconduct issue that becomes a national scandal, there is a risk that the policy and political system might overreact or react very strongly. So we've used a case study from Sweden. Let me emphasise, we don't criticise what they've done. That's Sweden, we aren't, as far as I know. and the way in which you would deal with this are different for all sorts of reasons, including cultural reasons. So it's not a criticism of Sweden, but it is a comment that they moved overnight in 2020 from a system of self-regulation where I used to deal a lot with their heads of universities, and they used to use the same argument to politicians as we did: give us the money and nick off. And suddenly they found overnight they moved to a centralised investigatory body. This was prompted by the Mascarini scandal, where a scientist at the Karolinska was found to engage in egregious research fraud that resulted in lives lost. In this case, whistleblowers were ignored. Investigated by Karolinska management shunned and had their careers destroyed before the scandal entered the public arena. And when it did reach the public, it severely damaged the reputation of the Karolinska and resulted in much of the management being forced to resign. The Swedish Parliament has reacted by instigating a national system. Now, as I said, Australia is not Sweden, and I don't criticise how they reacted. But given our system, it is conceivable that a public scandal could induce the political system to overreact here. When we look internationally, the picture is confused. And what we do know is that there is no perfect system. And we also know that one trend is clear. No one is deregulating the governance of research integrity. All the movement is towards greater regulation, greater public assurance. It's more a question of how it's done, not whether it's being done. And I think that we should learn from that too. In 2020, academic fellows asked us to look into this problem. So over the past 24 months, a range of individuals and organisations have been consulted, including the Universities Australia Board, their plenary, the DVC research grouping, other learned academies, officials in Commonwealth departments and ministers. In addition, discussions have been held with various individuals, including current and former members of the Australian Research Integrity Committee. I've also spoken to the science advisors in every federal department. The list goes on forever. And the good thing about it is that nobody has yet said that we shouldn't do something. They've all said we should do something, but let's design it right. Now, there was a story in Campus Morning Mail a couple of days ago where the endpoint was DVC research talking about how the choices for us were either dove or hawk. We designed whatever a dove and a hawk hybrid would be. I don't know what it would be or what it would look like, but we didn't design a hawk and we didn't design a dove because a dove would be of no use and a hawk is not what we need in this country. So we drew some conclusions. Clearly the present system has weaknesses. Clearly scientific integrity is under pressure globally, and misconduct and dealing with misconduct is under pressure globally from the open science movement and all the rest of it, as well as geopolitics, misinformation and changes at the science and policy interface. And although, another conclusion, although Australia's current system attempts to be all-encompassing, there are deficiencies in several areas such as coverage, accountability and transparency. And it is fair to say that if a Vice Chancellor of ANU, I didn't really know that we had to sign a deal that said that if somebody misbehaved, the ARIC would come into play at some level. I hope my Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research did, but I didn't. And so it wasn't embedded in, it wasn't a strong thread through the culture of the organisation that this should be. And I think that's because the implications of not taking much notice were actually fairly much at the margin. You know, was the process good? Can't comment on the outcome, can't comment on anything else, but was the process good? So that was okay at the time, but the question is it now time to change? We also made the point that where public funds or subsidies are provided to organisations, independent oversight will serve to reassure the public that funds are being used to support research of integrity, and when it isn't, that it will be dealt with appropriately and can't be, is independent of the interests of the institution and more, as it were, in the interests of the umbrella research and research integrity. So our working proposition is that Australia needs to chart a course between self-regulation and investigatory body, neither a dove nor a hawk. We should have a system that is national in scope across all sectors, including business and philanthropy, that'll test a bit of the will, particularly the business bit. That it should collect data and be able to publish reports which can act to showcase good research ethics and practices in our institutions, of course some of which are very good. Respects the diversity of organisations. Universities are different from MRIs and different from government agencies and departments and business, and the myriad of legislative frameworks, obligations and cultures that are embedded in the system. So the model we're arguing for is a different way, not self-regulation nor government interference. An evolution of the current system, we would call it. That there be a new body called Research Integrity Australia, which takes on the current functions and role of AREC, but with teeth, and provide oversight and assurance about the management of allegations of research misconduct. It would work with organisations to establish an investigation after a triage process that determines that an investigation is appropriate, leaving the organisations themselves to conduct the investigation. We did not want to set up a freestanding investigative body. It would issue reports to a responsible minister shortly after an investigation of a serious breach of the code, annually to report breaches other than major. It would cover all organisations, public, private and not-for-profit, which receive direct and indirect public funding for the conduct of research. All these organisations would, as a condition of grant, be required to agree to adhere to the Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research to allow RIA to have oversight of investigations of major breaches. The RIA would be responsible for collecting data on all cases and reporting, because it would actually be handy to know what the scale of the problem is. Every time I've talked to a politician, the first question is, what's the scale of the problem? Short answer is, we don't know. Why don't we know? Because nobody has to report the data, either at the trivial end or at the serious end. We don't know, unless it hits the press. Is that 5 to go or time? I'm almost on time. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that there is an issue here. We are human beings operating in systems designed by human beings, and sometimes the pressures, for whatever reason, mistakes, just genuine errors, will cause problems. And as Doug said, errors have got to get corrected as soon as you know that you've made them, and so on. But this needs to be, this is in our view, my view, is that we build a platform on which confidence can be built. And that confidence comes from how we handle it and how open we are about how we handle it. That we acknowledge what the size of the problem is and that we can manage it. And the body itself, Research Integrity Australia, should have the capacity to conduct or commission research on matters related to the oversight of misconduct. So in other words, be a place where information can be shared and understandings developed. And we also have argued that should there be a complaint about an organisation's total research culture and it stands a triage process, it's not just somebody having a whinge, there is actually substance to a complaint, then it might need to have the authority to conduct an investigation if it's at an institutional level and not about individual research project. So, and I do want to emphasise that an important feature is that the organisations themselves, universities, research agencies, whatever, would conduct the investigation. RIA will act, as it were, to provide quality assurance to the system as a whole and largely to the people who pay for it. We don't imagine that it will operate, resolve disputes or otherwise act as an ombudsman. I remember once getting complaints from a professor who couldn't park his car next to the door that he was used to entering the building through because the undergraduates had come back and some had the audacity to park in that car spot. Well, I don't think that we would invoke RIA to resolve that dispute. I did. It was quite amusing. So, as I said, I don't think it would conduct investigations itself, except in those instances where there was institutional problem and that the culture was inconsistent with the code at that institutional level. So what next? Well, we're continuing to discuss the proposal, its detail, its advantages, any disadvantages that come out with the sector and government. It's clear that not everybody supports it and not everybody will support it. Some people don't want to shift from what presently is or used to be self-regulation, leave us to handle it. I think most people certainly acknowledge that we can't just go about it the way we used to go about it. And the question then is whether you just raise the issue and let somebody else design it for you, or whether you're in there, as I said at the very beginning, and you lead the way in which we think we could most usefully develop a suitable system. We've spoken to ministers, public servants, organisations like yours. I've spoken to we've talked about whether it would go into Prime Minister and Cabinet, because the problem is if you put it into a department like education, the presumption will be that it's the universities that are the problem. If you put it into health, it'll presume that it's MRIs that are the problem and or medical schools that are the problem, and that's not the issue. The issue is that it's a whole of government thing, which is why we also think that it should include industry, because I don't believe that they are any less vulnerable to the pressures and human frailties as any other group of people, and they certainly do suck out a fair bit of money. But I don't anticipate ministers will be totally enamoured of that position. Indeed, one of them told us that it wasn't about research; it was about getting them a tax break, even though it's called the tax incentive for conduct of research. Not one of this government, let me hasten to add. So we can't paint them in black paint just yet. But it was said 2 or 3 years ago. So we are keeping it going. We are talking to people, and we will keep talking to probably most likely the Attorney General's Department. Makes it a bit legal, but it's got to be a whole of government one, and not that can be compartmentalised to look at a particular sector and say, well, they put it there because that must be where the problem lies. So all in all, I think that we are where we are because we understand that as scientists to continue to have a central role in the conduct and organisation of our society, of our economy, and indeed of our polity. We must always be alert to the imperative that we have to maintain public confidence. Doug mentioned the social licence, critically important. Can be taken away in a flash or modified in a flash, probably not taken away completely, but modified in a flash. And I think we have to be alert to that and to make sure that we're on the front foot and not reactive, and therefore reacting badly to changes as they arise. So it's up to us to do something about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Hi, everybody. I'm Carolyn McDonald. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at WeHi, and I'm here to facilitate some questions from the audience. We've got around 200 people online as well, so we'll be able to take questions from online as well as from the floor. We've got a couple of roving microphones in the room. If anybody has a question, please put your hand up and we'll bring you a mic. What a fantastic talk. Thank you, Ian. Really insightful. While I've got your attention, I'd like to open with a question, and perhaps tell us a little bit about how you think we might bring institutions and industry along with this change, because it is a change from what we currently have, and some people just want to keep the status quo. So what's the kind of mood in the room in terms of what people are prepared to move ahead with, and how do we actually bring them along through this change?
So the mood in the room was, and I confess that I've been very focused for the last 6 or 8 months on carbon trading and carbon farming initiatives and credits. So I think the momentum has dropped off a little. But there's not been a groundswell of opposition that's emerged in that time, although there are some people who belong to groups that were generally supportive who are individually not supportive. But I just think that we've got to work the political system on multiple fronts. I mean, it's one thing for a minister to look up and see me walking in the room to make an argument. It's another thing for that minister to see 2 or 3 people at different times walking in their door to make the same argument and say we've got to do this for whatever reason, expressed in our own words. So I wouldn't let up. I think it's important that we commit to doing something, and this, from our point of view, is a good starting position, because it's not a dove and it's not a hawk, and it does respect the organisations and their local cultures and the differences in cultures and so on. And so I think that we've just got to work on it collectively now. I think it's not just left to us or the Academy. From the Academy's point of view, we've been arguing now for a little while, and we've done it again in our pre-budget submission, that there should be a root and branch review of the research framework in Australia. I think that for me the reasons for that are almost self-evident, but there are 203 federally funded research programs across 13 portfolios, and no obvious coherence between them. But what it means is that your average researcher who's dependent on research grants has got to apply for 2 or 3 to get the amount of money they need to be able to do the job that we expect them or want them to do. So there are inefficiencies, there's overlap, there's probably duplication. And indeed, slightly amusingly, before the 2019 election, Bill Shorten announced that there would be a root and branch review of the Australian Research Framework, and he also announced that I would do it. And I had more friends within 2 days than I've ever had in my life. I had more offers for coffee or something stronger, the odd meal, and the day after the election, I was back to my usual 6. But the principle of that need is still there. So I think that collectively we would benefit from arguing that there is a need to do a really thorough look at how we support research in Australia. The British did it with Paul Nurse. They've learned a bit, they're doing it again. We, in the meantime, have talked about it, and we as an Academy have been pushing that forward. So if you put the 2 together, you would embed within that a mechanism by which you would handle research misconduct, and you would probably be more elaborate on research integrity than I was today. But the point about it is that if we want them to do the right thing by us, we have to do the right thing in return. And the best position for us is to help design it.
Thank you. A question down the front here.
You mentioned the Swedes setting up a system in response to a scandal, and 23 European countries have national offices, and so does US and Japan and China. Is there any system elsewhere that you think is the best or better than the others, or which ones would you choose as examples to learn from?
So I think that, so you will catch me out on the detail here, David, but we were impressed by what the Danes were trying to do, and we looked at that quite carefully, and then we sort of tried to put it into the Australian culture, and to an extent the British, although the British haven't gone as far as this goes, but it's the cultural issue that I think is key to this. And so how you shift a bunch of institutions from the notion of self-regulation, as we've argued. I mean, I spent 16 years as a Vice-Chancellor arguing that ministers should, put the parcel at the door and go away. So shifting from that to what is more appropriate for contemporary times will take a bit of effort. So that's what we tried to design here. Organisations still have responsibility, but when, for example, they do the terms of reference, there's a triage and there's going to be an investigation. So the terms of reference are agreed with the Research Integrity Australia. So it doesn't look like there's no opportunity to soft soap it. The findings go to Research Integrity Australia as well. But the aim would be to make sure that the institution is implementing the recommendations that come out of that independent review. And the 2 of them agree on the membership of the committee. And I remember you were part of a discussion once a couple of years ago. And I don't think this was from you, but there was a discussion going on And one individual talked about how an investigation into misconduct, the terms of reference set up by the institution said you can find them guilty of academic misconduct but not research misconduct. And I don't know how that would pass muster. I mean, it's the difference between a microwave lettuce leaf and the sack, basically. And so I don't know that anybody feels comfort in that, except maybe where it happened. And so it's important that we acknowledge that we haven't all got it right, which is what I've been trying to do with the politicians and other officials. And I would say, for example, CSIRO, ANSTO, ABARE, so that into the social sciences, they all thought we had to do something, and this was exposed to them all, and they weren't hostile to it in principle. So the detail, the devil's there, but there's not a lot of detail hidden behind this. There would be things that you've got to do. So I would be reasonably optimistic that what we've designed is suitable for Australia, Australia's culture, Australia's Australia's spread of institutions, and the involvement of the Commonwealth Government, which funds 203 research. So some of them are tadpoles. I mean, if you broke it down to serious research support, it might be 40 or 50, but even 40 or 50 is a lot, with no designed coherence between those programs. And so put it all together, and I think, you know, there's a message there that we could win. And we say to politicians essentially what I said there, and that is nobody is deregulating. Everybody is looking at how to make it better and more, provide more confidence to people that this is all done properly. And if there's a problem, that it's actually well managed. And I think if you put all that together, we can make quite a good story and hopefully a successful one. So we've got to talk to the present Science Minister, of course, about it. We haven't spoken to him about it yet in anything like this detail. But some minister will have to take it through government if they agree.
I've got another question from the floor and then we'll go to online.
Hello, thanks so much for that view of research conduct. One of the things that you touched on and Doug touched on was communication of all of this to the public. So I was wondering, what are the strategies that you're considering about how all of this information would be communicated to the public? Would it be a high level, like population level of institutes and universities data, or would you present data from each institute? And how would you deal with that gray area where, you know, an error can result in something, but it wasn't misconduct? How would the public view that? Have you considered it?
Well, yes, but not in as much detail as we'd have to. And I think it's a very fair question. I mean, what do you put out in public? You know, you're probably all aware, but 3 weeks ago or so, the committee reporting on foreign interference proposed that there be a research integrity arm, which was rejected on the grounds of reputational risk. So people are conscious of reputational risk, and I mean, you wouldn't want to put organisations into a position where their reputation was at risk because a couple of people made a mistake. So I wouldn't imagine that a mistake would get through to a serious investigation. It might take an investigation sometimes to discover that it was a mistake, but there ought to be a better way to handle it on average. So we'd have to work that out. I think I would be opting for aggregated data and not institutional specific for publication. I don't know that you would achieve anything by saying in year 1 this university had a problem, in year 2 that division of CSIRO, and in year 3, you know, some other business organisation. I think aggregated data would be useful, because what you're trying to do is to say we're on top of this and we have a mechanism to handle it when there's a problem. We have a mechanism to handle it, to identify where there's a problem, which we call a triage mechanism. But everybody has a right to know that we are handling it, and you do that by aggregating the data.
Do we have a question from the from online first. We're going to go online first.
Online question from Adrian Barnett. I support the body and the idea of a triage process. However, I worry that the triage process will get bogged down in petty academic rivalries. How will the triage differentiate the serious issues from the silly?
Putting something in the drinking water. It is a problem, of course it's a problem, you know, and I do think, I mean, so in the mind's eye, right, and I wouldn't put more emphasis on it than that what you have is a triage that basically says this is for an institution to handle, and you should be able to do, if it's somebody's whinging about order of authors on a paper, which is a fair problem for some people, and I don't deny that it shouldn't be resolved, but it's an institutional issue. It's not something you'd send on for an investigation or anything, unless that happens so frequently in that institution across a wide range of disciplines that there was a cultural problem within the institution, that might warrant it. So you'd have to have those nuances in it. But I think an organisation that had its internal arrangements sufficiently well structured, then disputes over the sequence of authors on a paper or car parking or things like that would not get through any gate. They would be handled internally, and it would be up a notch before it got to the triage, and it would be up a big notch when it got to an investigation, because that would be about serious misconduct, which in our paper we define as fraud, plagiarism, flagrant breach of the code, and something else. There's a fourth one, equally bad, but I can't remember what it is. So there are four things that if the triage suggests that it's one of those four, it goes through to an investigation. If it's something lesser, it gets handled internally. But you wouldn't want to clog it up. That's a fair comment.
Thanks, Professor Chubb. Question. I think there's obviously a continuum where we are familiar and worried about academic fraud, synthetic results, cutting and pasting Western blots, but there's another there's a spectrum which takes you towards selective data reporting, as Doug alluded to, p-hacking, inappropriate use of false discovery, concealment of negative results, and I think that's an area that I think possibly drives a component of the reproducibility crisis, and is partly and is motivated by perhaps instincts that are maybe foreign to maybe the outside world, which is really about academic success, because the audience of our research is usually driven by positive results, and we have a concern about publishing null findings or negative findings. So I guess part of the regulatory framework, will that in some ways engage with the academic community and the academic recipients of our research to perhaps accept the idea of negative results, or find a way to communicate those so that there's still value to our science, even when unfortunately the result is negative?
Yeah, again, I mean, that's a very fair question, and I think so. The view that we've discussed as we've gone around and talked to these various groups is that part of the deal here would be that the organisations concerned have got to make sure that their internal cultural arrangements to get that part of it right first, so that people are not expected to behave in particular ways to meet internal objectives, get grant money or publish X papers a year or whatever it might be. And that'll be different from one place to another. But I think that the other part of the culture as a research community has to be that all data are on the stump. They're all out there and available. And the reason that I raised the 3 million data points that led to completely different conclusions was because people ought to be able to see how you analysed your data to come up with the conclusions you drew, and engage in a constructive discussion with you. So that does mean publishing them all, negative as well as positive. It means the outliers. I mean, I'm hot to trot on outliers, because this dramatic photograph of me earlier I was actually an outlier because I responded better to that treatment than most, certainly the other Australians in the trial. And so I said to them, well, what would you do in the normal situation? You look at the average. Well, I responded much different. So the issue of outliers, the issue of negative results, all of that, I think comes down to a research culture. And I would be really happy that if Australia developed a consistent approach to this across all our organisations, where we overtly encouraged it because we thought it was important for us to do. And that actually means building up that framework, if you like, that says that this is how we approach research integrity in this country, and we leave it up to people in other countries to follow us, and we also leave it to other people, our peers, wherever they happen to be, to get in there and have a look at what we do and how we do it and the methods we choose and the assumptions we make, all of which are valid as part of the way we do our science. But other people might bring a different perspective on it, and they should be able to do that. So I think a national approach would be really good and encourage institutions to comply with a sort of framework that says we're open, we're transparent, we value the full range and the full robust discussion that comes from making it all available. And if that was a national strategy, it would be one order of magnitude better than She'll Be Right, Mate.
We've got another question down here, and then Len.
I was wondering whether the view was that the national body would actively seek complaints from whistleblowers and whether it would have a role in protecting whistleblowers and the treatment of them within institutions.
So the answer to that is that yes, we do believe that not so much actively seek, but be a place where whistleblowers could go and be protected through whatever arrangements that would be made. I think that a couple of celebrated cases recently, we've become aware that, at least in the early stages, whistleblowers weren't looked after as well as probably they should. But of course, we all know that some whistleblowers are just people who complain and not actually, don't like that person, so they put in a complaint or whatever. And I probably have seen that as a Vice Chancellor. So you need to be a bit careful. But the principle is that that we're all each other's keeper in this area, really. And if people see behaviours that they think are inappropriate, there should be a mechanism by which they can make that known without sacrificing their own careers and essentially livelihoods. So we'd imagine that this would be a place where whistleblowers could go and their identity would be protected, but it would go through some sort of triage in case it was just, somebody fell out with somebody and whinged. I mean, whistleblowers, I think, are incredibly important because it's that observation of behaviours that sometimes leads to a real thing, and potentially real consequences. But equally, they can't be sanctified because I think experience tells us that they're not all pure. But we shouldn't deny the fact that some are, and so it's important to get the right end and not say, well, you can't. I think whistleblowers are central to a lot of this.
That was your question. Okay, so we'll go to John and then online for the last question.
Research Integrity Australia sounds a great concept for someone recently moved from Britain. Create a public body and it always wants more money. And if I follow you correctly, you were suggesting that this would be funded from the public purse, i.e. the science budget. So what proportion of the science budget should be spent on Research Integrity Australia? Because someone is going to have to field demands from it for more money every year.
So the way that we've proposed that it be set up, our estimation is that it'd be somewhere around about 5 to 8 million a year, because it's not an investigative body. So the institutions carry the cost of an investigation, but it doesn't. So we have estimated that it will be somewhere in that ballpark. And presently we spend something to the order of, I don't know what it is now, 15 billion or something. So and if it's taken off the top of government, it's a fairly small slice from each of the components. So we didn't want to set up an expensive, black hole into which resources would continuously pour. It would grow because it would expand its role. But if you started off in that way with that constrained brief, then it's got limited scope to expand. So somebody would have to come along, and the minister would have to come along and say, well, we wanted to do this too, consequence of which is they've got to put more money in or whatever. But they're decisions down the track, but it wouldn't be huge. It'd be enough people to be able to conduct a triage mechanism and to engage with the institutions as need be on a case-by-case basis. So if the problem's huge, then they might need more. I don't think it's that huge. So that's why we settled on that sort of figure.
We've got one. No, Davo?
Just to make a comment, in Sweden, they found after they set up their body, I think they got about 36 cases. They were surprised how many they did get. So yeah. Clearly there was demand that wasn't being fulfilled.
Yeah, and we'd anticipated that would be the case too. But given that the primary role of the Research Integrity Australia as we define is the initial triage, and then it's a sort of monitoring exercise. So there's a complaint about somebody in Weehai, you say, we'd like these terms of reference, these are they, Research Integrity Australia says okay, this is the investigating committee, the integrity committee says okay. When the thing is done, the recommendations go to Research Integrity Australia as well, and then they liaise with you to make sure they're implemented. And so it's not an incredibly bureaucratic or onerous role, but it'll likely be bigger in the first year or two than later on is what you'd expect from elsewhere.
A double-barreled paraphrase of an online question. The first is, isn't what you're talking about fundamentally driven by the failure of the peer review system? And secondly, there's a two-faced attitude to change. People and institutions say they want this, but they're not prepared either to put their shoulder to the wheel and may even resist it in covert ways.
Oh yeah, so the latter one requires leadership, and given adequate leadership, you can get things done. So it would not be enough for a federal government or ministers or whatever simply to say we're going to do this now. You go away and do it, and we won't bother to check. So yeah, it requires leadership, and it requires a system that enables the individuals who are ultimately putting the money into the system as a whole to be sure that what they think is happening. And I like to think that sometimes politicians do exercise leadership, and sometimes I'm disappointed. But sometimes I'm not, and so I think it's getting that right mix and that they can do it. On the first one, failure of the peer review system, almost every instance that I can think of that's happened in Australia, and David knows more about it than me, but I think it's the peer community that's identified the problem. That's where it starts. Now, the peer review, if you take a very narrow view of peer review, like it's the 2 or 3 people who review your manuscript before publication, then sure, stuff gets through. But as I said earlier, for me, the most important part of the peer review system was it goes out there and everybody who's an expert in your field reads it. And they critique it, they write a paper that, abolishes it, criticises it, whatever. That's where the system is at its best. And I think that all of the ones that I'm aware of anyway were picked up by peers looking at the work after it was published. So it'd be good to catch it beforehand. But, when it's looked at by 500 people, it's a bit different from 2 people looking at it who are reviewing, or 3 looking at a manuscript. So some will get through that stage, but they don't last long out there in the world if they're seriously flawed.
I think with that, we will call this wonderful discussion to a close. Thank you so much, Ian, for giving us a big chunk of your day. Thank you, Cal, for orchestrating questions. And most of all, thank you to precinct partners around Parkville who've come to make this a really vibrant session, and to the WeHi staff and students that have been part of it. I know a number of you are active on social media, and it's not just leaders that need to be a voice advocating for this sort of body. It needs to come from the grassroots, from the bottom up. And so I'd ask if you can reflect on what Ian has talked to us about today, and if you think it's a good idea, begin to socialise these ideas within your communities. And for me, that's the way these ideas get momentum and that we will get change. So a call to arms for those of you in the audience with a voice. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Cal. And thank you for everybody being part of an important discussion.